out at the front desk. So if you didn't get one in the mail, pick one up on your way out. It's going to be a great time. We'll be honoring those original members that helped build this place, but also talk about what Copernik of the future is going to be. And our keynote speaker will be a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, Dr. Stanley Whittingham, who teaches at Binghamton University, is going to be our keynote speaker. So you get to be close to greatness if you come. So, but one of the things, we do many things here. We do a lot of school outreach. We do the summer camps. But one of the things I really enjoy a lot is these Friday night programs. It's an opportunity for us to sort of continue our education. So especially those young kids in the audience here, your schooling doesn't end at 12th grade or at college. It continues throughout your life. And here's an opportunity to learn about something that may not either, you may not have known about or you want to know more about. And it's not everything that we do up here on a Friday night is always about astronomy. However, what we do is, especially on a night like tonight, we have a rule that you cannot leave Kopernik until you look through a telescope. So put your keys up here, and we'll get them back to you once you've shown that you've looked through a scope. And tonight's going to be a great night. We've had sort of about a month and a half of pretty much cloudy nights, but tonight's going to be great. And there's a very minor chance we may have an opportunity to see some aurora. So let's hope. All right. Actually, what we should hope for is a power outage in Vestal, and then we'll have a slightly better chance of seeing it. Otherwise, we get to see what we call the Vestal Nebula. But anyway, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Tom O'Brien, who teaches at Binghamton University, and also, as it turns out, is a board member here at the Kopernik Observatory. And this is a subject that's very near and dear to his heart. And so we are going to turn this over to you. All right. I forgot this other tab. Starting in 2020, we started live streaming our Friday night programs. It started out as a sort of a reaction to COVID, but even now that we're back offering live, in-person programming, we found that people really enjoy it. We have over 13,000 subscribers, and so what's also great about it is so tonight is science and religion. Last Friday we had talk about the summer skies. The Friday before that, dinosaur artifacts, ring worlds of the solar system, how our minds learn the sounds of speech. So you can actually go to our website, go to the YouTube website, type in Kopernik Observatory, and you have access to these programs. So we had a couple weeks ago the Binghamton University robotic seeing eye dog here. So along with even some observing events that we've done some solar and lunar eclipse events here. So anyway, check out our YouTube channel. It's great. Even if you can't come up here on a Friday night, you can plug in on the YouTube and you can ask your question over the chat. So and what's nice is we've been able to actually make make friends, make connections to people literally around the world. There's usually this one person from Adelaide, Australia, who's actually watching Saturday afternoon in Australia, but we'll plug in. So it's a great resource. So anyway, now we're going to go back to Dr. O'Brien and our presentation tonight. So give me a second. I'll get rid of this.
Well, thank you for investing your time.
Did you turn on your mic?
I only had one thing to do. There we go. How's that?
Okay, we'll be in a second.
Again, thank you for thank you for coming out this evening at Kopernik. Lots of great programs here. Hopefully tonight you'll have a return on investment from this talk. But if not, it's worth coming up here just to see the scopes and to see the night sky on a non-cloudy night. So the topic here is science and religion. I need to give just a little context for it. I was trained as a chemist. I was also born and raised and still am a practicing Catholic. I went to Catholic grade school, went to public high school, went to Catholic college, taught at a public school, taught at a Catholic school, went to public university, and now I've been teaching at BU for 37 years. So I've lifelong interest in science and religion, and I've never seen a conflict. So I should state up front my bias, if you will. What I'm going to try to share is a little bit of the history and what I consider the misperceptions about there being this big either-or scenario. Other than that, the only other thing in the title I should probably say, the word epistemological. Does anyone know what that means? Did anyone come out just to find out what that word means? One person. So think about it as, the easiest way I think about it is a subset of philosophy that deals with how we know what we know. So one of the things we're going to be looking at tonight is what is it about science that makes it perhaps somewhat unique, and does it overlap with religion? So there we go. I normally teach 3-hour classes. This is not going to be 3 hours. But what is going to be similar to what I always do is I really believe that you learn as a result of what you think and what you do, not what the presenter says. If it catalyzes your thinking, or if I get you engaged with some activities, so rather than just a straight talk, we have 4 activities that we're going to build in tonight. One of them is hands-on. All of them are what I call minds-on. So this one here, thinking about science and religion, and thinking about maybe it's different ways of perceiving the same reality. What I have are 3 examples of what are called ambiguous figures. So what I'd like you to do is look at each of them left to right and look at it and see what you see in the image. And hopefully something will come right to mind for each of them. And then, after you've figured out at least one of the 3, look back to that and see if you can see something else in the image. And we could turn this into a 20-minute activity. We're not. We're going to do it quick. But just take a quick look. So let's start with this one here. Can somebody tell me one thing you see in that? A young woman. How many people with that now as a cue can see a young woman? And maybe it can help here. This is the chin of a young woman. This is her one ear, and she's turned her angle is sort of like the angle of my head now. That's her eyelashes and her eye, and she's got a nice hat on. So we're going to be talking a lot tonight about the good, the true, and the beautiful, which is the essence of what is called natural philosophy and theology. Natural philosophy we now call science. That's a relatively new term, 1880s. So in this particular case, yes, there's a young, beautiful woman. Does anyone see an older woman? So the older woman, if you look right here, we have a chin, a mouth, which was the neckline for the young woman, a mouth, and a huge nose. And then one eye and the other eye off there. So perhaps part of the problem with the perception, and I'm saying it's a misperception, of science versus religion, is that they both capture part of reality. And it turns out with these ambiguous figures, even after you know what they are, you can't see both at once very well. I'm going to suggest you can see science and religion at once, and that's the way I've lived, and it's never been a contradiction. The second one here, any thoughts about what that one might be? So again, the theme of a woman, if we're looking at that outline, and once again, probably a younger, probably attractive woman, does anyone see something different? So the musicians may have seen a saxophone. It's been stated that music was developed in ancient times. They believe we had music before we had words. When I say we, I mean Homo sapiens. And it's been hypothesized that part of the purpose was for men to woo women. I don't know that we have hard evidence of that, but it does work sometimes. How about this one here? What do we see there?
Man looking to the left.
So a man looking to the left. So you're saying this is the eyes, this is the nose, this is the mouth, and the chin. Could you tell me anything about the ethnicity of the man you see?
It looks like something from Easter Allen.
Something from Easter Allen. Okay. Let me give you a cue. There, in America, none of us were really native, but the first Americans that we call Native Americans, do you know where they came from? They were Asians. And some of them stayed in New York and in northern states, and some of them moved south. The ones that were north were actually up into Canada and even above Canada before they came down here. So the Bering Sea, there was a bridge across it. And it turns out both of these are Native Americans. So the other Native American, we're not seeing the head, but we're seeing a Native American from the north. Anyone see an Eskimo? So we're looking at the back of the Eskimo, and he's looking back that way. So whether we're talking science or whether we're talking religion, part of the issue is how do we perceive things? So that's what we want to play with a little bit here. Okay, so the human quest for understanding and happiness has been around since before there were Homo sapiens. Other Homo genus had the ability to understand, and most certainly were concerned about happiness. As man evolved, we developed different disciplines or field. Religion being a very ancient one, art, including music, being ancient, and science being relatively recent compared to the other two. And so the question is, how these three disciplines, are they three separate things? And tonight we're going to focus on science and religion. But the good, the true, and the beautiful, are they completely separate? So Drew made mention of, the aurora borealis. This is a picture in May, sometime this past May, in North Carolina. The northern lights being seen in North Carolina. So that raises all kinds, it's certainly artistic, it's beautiful. And beauty, I think, is most often good. But the science behind like that, how do you get the northern lights in still northern, but North Carolina? That's pretty impressive. So science, as well as religion, tries to understand and tell stories that make sense of the world. So my argument is that transdisciplinary understanding gives us the most holistic picture. That we see, it's not just a Native American from the north, an Eskimo. It's also the head of a Cherokee Indian. So, historically, in high school, I had the good fortune of discovering Socrates, and as written by Plato. Like Jesus Christ, Socrates never wrote anything. Plato has one of his essays explaining why Socrates said he didn't want to write things down, because he was skeptical that people would read things and have words and not have understanding. That there'd be illusion of eloquence would give people the illusion of understanding, and they were different. But this beautiful analogy he gave us, and I just want to briefly describe it, and think of it in light of the past activity we did. So basically what Socrates said is that human beings are perceptual prisoners, and that we're chained looking at a wall, and behind us there's some sort of flickering lights and movement that's producing shadows on the wall. And our job is to try to interpret the shadows. That's very much what cognitive neuroscientists say, as well as how your brain works. The interesting thing he said, though, that if you broke free of the chains, you could turn around and see, there's a show up there. And there's internal light, but there's also a little light coming up from above. And so Plato and Socrates identified this ideal world, which in a Christian motif would be heaven, of pure forms, of the perfect good, the perfect true, the perfect beautiful. And that, of course, is the Christian conception. And again, the talk on religion here, there's all kinds of interesting things in Buddhism and Taoism. We're not going there tonight. If we have a chance, we'll touch on Taoism real quick. But mainly tonight is Judeo-Christian. So that's the context I'm speaking from. And the idea then was what philosophy was about, was learning to live the good life by breaking free of your chains. And I would argue that, again, having multiple disciplines as different lenses. So just like I could have reading glasses, which is all I need, but if I needed distance lenses, I could have Verilux or bifocals. So having science and religion is like that, is the analogy. Jumping forward a little bit from 400 or so BC to right before the start of the scientific revolution, we had a brilliant polymath named Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci said that all our knowledge has its origins in our perceptions. True, except our perceptions, there is no such thing as an immaculate perception. So he says, well, I'm unbiased. Impossible. You're biased by virtue of the fact that you're a human being. No one in this room can see in the infrared or ultraviolet. No one. If we had a pit viper in here and the room was completely dark, he would see this many glowing bodies. Pit vipers see in the infrared. So already by the virtue of the fact that we're humans, we're biased. We don't see all of reality. Beyond that, our individual life experiences. If I hadn't been raised Roman Catholic, I would never have met my wife. And that, there. We met actually on the altar. I say that people, you met your wife on the altar, like, no, there wasn't arranged marriage. She was a musician and I was faking it. And she looked at me and she said, that guy needs help. So eventually she married me and it all worked out. But that experience in my life, if I wasn't Roman Catholic, I never would have met her. And that has biased my life in some ways, I think positively so. But a different scenario could have played out differently. So there is no immaculate perception. We all have different biases. One of the cool things about science is that we can take the blinders off and we can see in the infrared. We can see in the ultraviolet. We can see X-rays. I would suggest religion also has that capability. The religious take on that by the poet William Blake, he said, if the doors of perceptions were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself, man being man or woman, has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of a cavern. So if we think about this science religion, and I'm going to shift between calling science natural philosophy. By the end of the talk, I'll tell you when the word science was introduced. It was called natural philosophy for the first couple hundred years. What are different ways we can envision a dialogue between these two things? So the title of the talk said basically three. One is conflict, and I'm suggesting that is historically actually very bad history, and I'll show you why. Secondly is complementarity, and the third is a variation of complementarity, it's consilience, and we'll get to what those terms mean. So the first one, the constant conflict model. So this assumes that there's a winner-take-all, that it's either science or religion. You got to choose. You can't say, well, yes, it's both a beautiful young woman and it's an old woman. You can't do that. You have to pick one or the other. There's only one reality. And typically, that's a very stereotyped view. So the stereotype view says, well, science is about facts, which ultimately is naturalism. It says, basically, it's matter and energy, and that's it. If you can't weigh it, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Secondly, science is all about reason and rationality. Those two are opposed to faith must be blind faith. You must just, as one famous atheist said, you have to check your brain at the church door if you're going to walk into a church. I do not believe that is accurate, but the stereotype view is. And that somehow revelation is opposed to reason and rationality. So when St. Paul was knocked off, the story where he was knocked off his horse when he was going to persecute Christians, he subsequently lost all reason. And even if one was an atheist and you read the letters of St. Paul and stuff, this is not somebody who's lost all reason. He was very, very trained in Greek philosophy, actually, and particularly Stoicism. And then lastly, that if it's science, it must necessarily be atheistic. And that is completely inaccurate. In contrast to theism, and theism must just be a god of the gaps. That we get, as science gets bigger, religion gets smaller, and that's it. So what I'd like us to give you a little bit of background for, and then we'll do an activity on where that came from. And it's neat that we're right here in Vestal, New York, because that came from Cornell. a brilliant university that's done just great science. But it came out about at a time, most people don't realize that universities were started in the Western world by Roman Catholics. And by the time the Protestant Reformation on, the next wave were either Roman Catholic or Protestant. All the universities were initially training for religious people, and then you could get non-religious degrees. But historically, that's where universities came from. And that was a problem for some, particularly, this is right around the time Cornell's formed, that we have Darwin and the theory of evolution, and there's certainly some friction going on. I'd like to think of adversarial collaboration is a better term. That people can collaborate even when they're adversarial. And it turns out he felt a great threat because he founded a university that had no religious affiliation. Before then, a few people, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, the universities they founded, weren't as strongly religiously linked as the ones before them, but they still were religiously linked. They trained clerics. They trained religious people. Cornell was different. And so in 1869, not long after the Civil War ended, a new one started. And he said the battlefields of science. And he used language and outlining the great sacred struggle for the liberty of science. Comparatively petty warfares of Alexander or Caesar, Napoleon, compared to this warfare between science and religion. So this is fighting language. This is we're not adversarial collaborators. This is a winner-take-all war. That was added to even more by, as a chemist, the founding president of the American Chemical Society, the single largest, single discipline science organization in the world. ACS is international. They publish more journals than any other association. The founder was virulently anti-Catholic, partly because his wife, or his sister rather, converted to Roman Catholicism. And so he wrote a book called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And it talked about antagonism between religion and science, a narrative of the conflict between contending models. So this notion of a battleground. And then the Cornell president came back with a book, which I had the good pleasure to read my first or second year in teaching, so 78, 79, something like that. It was a history of the warfare of theology and Christendom. And so it outlined all this supposed history. There were some neat things in this book, but it turns out in the last 30 years, it's been historians say it's completely fictional. Neither of these books, supposedly on the history, are considered good history anymore. But again, he outlined this notion. He allowed that there might be some truths if maybe religion got out of the way and it was just dealt with this notion of an abstract power in the universe and contributed to morality. But otherwise, it should really get out of the universities and just get out of science's way that it's holding us back. Pretty severe stuff. So let's take a look at that with an analogy. So what I'd like you to think about as I'm blowing balloons up here. So there's all kinds of great science you can do with balloons. The history of chemistry started with a series of studies of gases, which people considered nothing. And yet, in fact, gases, which is a word that means chaos, have the ultimate order. What I want you to think about while I'm blowing up. Two things. I'm going to set up this system right here, and I want you to think about what are the possible outcomes. I don't want to know what the right answer is. So get that out of your mind. I don't care about the right answer. What do I care about? What scientists are good at, and I would offer the best theologians are good at, are thinking, what are the possibilities? Let's lay out multiple hypotheses. So think of at least 3 different things that could happen if I remove the clamps here. I don't want the answers. Think. You have a question of the question? I don't want the answer. I don't want your idea yet. I want everybody to think. What's one idea? I'm having trouble blowing this up. One idea. One idea. Not the right answer. What's one idea? No pressure. I'm sorry, what?
An experiment.
It's an experiment, right? I'm sorry, what? Yeah, no, I want to know actually what are the possible outcomes if I remove clamps? What's one?
Both balloons will end up being the same size. They'll even out.
So both balloons could wind up being the same size. I'm having trouble blowing this balloon up. The lid doesn't work. So they both could, so that would be the bigger one makes the smaller one bigger until they're equal. That's one possibility. What's another possibility?
Another possibility is
So it all collapses into one balloon. What's another possibility?
stay the same.
So we could have a situation where we said two different things there, where the smaller one, can you hold that for me, dear? So bigger gets bigger at the expense of the smaller. Smaller gets smaller. Smaller gets bigger, or no change at all. So take your vote. We won't keep track, but thinking about possibilities is really important. So the red balloon is bigger, and we're going to let that go. No trick. These are two identical balloons. If we had more time, we could show you lots of variations. This is what always happens. How many people predicted that the small balloon would get smaller? So I've done this. I think the largest crowd I had was back in '87. I had every chemistry teacher on the island of Puerto Rico. So they said there were 100. It was the whole chemistry group. We were doing something else that I was involved in at the time. And I did a talk on how your brain works. And so we used this at that point. I've done it with physics professors at BU. Almost invariably, 99% of the people get it wrong. The difference between if you have a degree in science or not is how much verbiage you put around it. So people talk about equilibrium and all this great stuff. And then I ask the question that I'll ask you. How many people have ever blown a balloon up? When is it hardest to blow up? When it's small or as it gets bigger? Okay, so we have an intuitive sense based on our experience that we know the answer. And sadly, the way we teach in science and most of our disciplines, we don't ask people to think about actual experiences. Now, there's a beautiful law called Laplace's law that explains this. There's biological applications. This is hugely important. But for right now, I want to use this as a metaphor. So most people have said, well, science is the big one. And I'll try to get it back. Very, very difficult to do when it's this far gone. A little bit. So one way of viewing this, if this was science, we could say, historically, it is absolutely the case that religion fed science. And many scientists atheist scientists who are willing to acknowledge that, and many don't acknowledge that, suggest then, but yeah, religion is gone. And that's actually not the reality at all. So as an analogy, just because something is big doesn't mean that it will blow up something that's smaller. And just because something's small doesn't mean it doesn't matter. So with that in mind, let's go on. The predict, observe, explain, logical, empirical evidence, logical argument, skeptical review, that's the epistemology of science. In science, we base things on empirical arguments, so arguments tied to experiments, observations and experiments, logical arguments, and then you got to be skeptical about. Like people said, well, you started off with two different sized balloons, or one balloon was thicker. No, they're two identical balloons. And I blew them up once just so I didn't blow my brains out. And for some reason, these are cheap balloons. They don't have a good lip on them. So in any case, once you think about regardless of how you thought about religion and science when you came in, what do you think, could there be future mutually beneficial interactions between the two? And are they even happening now? It's just not publicized. So that's a question. I'm going to ask more questions than I give answers tonight. So the other side. So there are four brilliant but extremely arrogant people who two of them I believe are dead now. Really interesting writing. Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. Samuel Harris, Letters to a Christian Nation. The philosopher Dennett, who recently died, I think, Breaking the Spell. And he's written a whole lot of really interesting books. But they actually, in some sense, had adversarial collaboration with the extreme version of religion, which is fundamentalist religion that says the Bible is a science book. And if the Bible says the earth is 6,000 years old, all of what we know about chemistry, physics, astronomy, all of it's garbage. You can't just pull one thing out and say, oh, you just got the date wrong by billions of years. That is a form of religion which is anti-science. But it turns out those two groups made a lot of money by debating each other and writing books. And they both agreed that science, if it's true, replaces religion. Therefore, science must be false if you're a fundamentalist. And of course, the opposite if you're a scientist. And they were evangelical. It was almost like a religion without a God. I've read multiple books of these people. Very interesting reading in one sense. I've listened to multiple lectures. They fundamentally have some real serious flaws in their understanding of what religion is. And they pick the stereotyped image only. So in any case, winner take all. So what is it that they were promoting? They were promoting what we call scientism. So science, the way I explain to my students, is a game. Now the fact that basketball has certain rules to it doesn't mean that the game of football can't exist. Different games, different slices of reality have different sets of rules. Some may be overlapping. In neither of those sports are you supposed to directly hit somebody in the face, but they're different sets of rules. So scientism says there's only one game, and it's a game called science. So everything that exists is a thing. It's matter or energy. There has been no design built into the universe. Evolution is completely purposeless. Life is actually purposeless. That if you could understand where all the atoms and electrons were, everything is predictable. So there is no free will. This is basically what they're selling, which doesn't make sense on all kinds of levels. But that is scientism versus science. So science says, yeah, we're going to decide to not pull the rabbit, the God rabbit out of the hat, so to speak. If I'm explaining something, so I had the pleasure when I was a young man of making a new chemical compound. Something had never been on the planet. Nowhere in the write-up of that did I say, this is true because God made it so. Because if you say that, then the game of science is done. God made it so, okay. Where scientists always holds that, if they believe in a God, that's always in the background. We're concerned with proximate causes. What's the nearest term explanation for how I made that new chemical? That's what science is about. And so empirical evidence, logic, argument, skeptical review. But it turns out we can't prove the non-existence of something that isn't matter or energy. Sort of by definition. So there's a long history of connection between science and religion by people that have worn both hats. This is a well-known physicist and theologian and historian of science who died a number of years back. But he says, for reasons inherent in the method of physical science, no watertight proof of the existence of God can be built on data and conclusions. So that empirical evidence, logical, or skeptical view, theologians and religious people can use that, but you're never going to prove that God exists. That is a leap of faith. But the reverse is also true. You can't prove God doesn't exist. Just because we can't weigh it, we can't measure it, so you can't disprove the existence of non-physical things, is basically what it comes down to. So an alternative view. So this warfare model is problematic. Evolutionary biologist by the name of Stephen Jay Gould suggested what he called non-overlapping magisteria. He said that people just have to stay in their separate corners. So the corner of science is dealing with matter and energy, measurable, testable, rule-bound interactions, and religion deals with the moral world. So science says what is, religious deals with what ought. And if people just stay in their separate corners, we can agree to, it's not play together, we can agree to play in different sandboxes. and just not play together at all. That position is problematic for a couple reasons. So this is way more words than you need, but if you're interested in the world of morality, for several decades there's been a group that's been researching completely a-religiously, not anti-religious, a-religious, from no agnostic perspective. What are the chief values? And basically it comes down to this set of 24. And I would argue there is no science without most of these. So you can't say Stephen Jay Gould, so religion is about values and then science is about this other world. You can't practice science without curiosity and creativity and teamwork and kindness and fairness and prudence and self-regulation. Science doesn't work well if people cheat, if they're not honest. And similarly, it's interesting on this list, which has nothing to do with God or religion, that they actually put the notion of transcending self in the context of spirituality. And the notion of spirituality doesn't necessarily equal religion, which is a different take than Stephen took. Some fun quotes. So the previous Pope, John Paul II, science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Two people who are both more agnostic than theistic, they both have said they were not atheists, and they were often assumed to be so. They, in their own words, said they weren't. Carl Sagan said, skeptical scrutiny is the means in which both science and religion, by which deep thoughts can be winnowed from deep nonsense. So he's suggesting both fields have to deal with rational thought and skepticism. And Einstein, who definitely didn't believe in a personal God kind of figure, said science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. So again, neither of those two people are talking about traditional Protestantism or Roman Catholicism, but they both acknowledge there's something there. What we need perhaps is a bit of humility. And Newton, who was not known as a humble man, if you know anything about the history of physics, but he said, I do not know what I appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been like a little boy playing on a seashore and diverting myself with smooth pebbles and pretty shells, whilst the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before me. That image there on the side, that solar flare, is why we saw the aurora borealis in North Carolina. 93 million miles away, we had a major, powerful solar flare that caused a really stronger than average distortion in our geomagnetic field around the Earth. And that caused it to be seen that far. So a bit of humility. Let's make sure we're going to get a couple things in here. So again, I want you to think. I don't care what the right answer is right now. But the question that I pose to you is, if we were to try to combine these two. So if one of those is science and religion, would they both fit in the same container? And if so, why? And if not, why not? It's interesting, food coloring stains the heck out of your hands. So I thought these gloves were a little bigger, but let's see. So I'm just going to put a little color in. And that's sort of interesting in and of itself, and all the rules that are going on there, along with a bit of chaos. And questions like, if one of them was hot and one of them cold, would that matter? It would matter dramatically. We're not going to show you that right now. Well, that looked like it had stuff in. Always good to have the backup. So give that a little thought. Proper chemical technique here. If you're only dealing with water, and both of these are identical, it turns out if one of those was alcohol and one of those was water, would have something very dramatically different happen. But we're going simple here. So think about there. Can science and religion be considered complementary disciplines that could productively mix? what are the risks and benefits of that? So let's go one more here. So this, again, could take a lot longer, but this should help you think this through. So those are two different ways of dividing a vase that's fluted, that is angled. One way is bilateral symmetry in the vertical direction, like we're bilaterally symmetrical down the middle. The other one is bilaterally symmetrical, but in the horizontal dimension. So many people think, well, science is very concrete here, and religion is just a bunch of a vacuum or gas. It's all empty. So what are your thoughts? Will they fit together? How many people think they will fit together without spilling? Because I can't always spill. So we have just a couple. And you can do this at home, but let's do it. Something else interesting happens here. This is just food coloring. Most time you see a color change, it's due to a chemical reaction. The exception, the most common exception, is food coloring. Okay, so there's, we'll get caught there? That's magic. No, that's not magic. That's science. And it's mathematics. And there's multiple ways of explaining that, but the simplest thing to think about in this picture here, this is 50-50. That is not 50-50. Okay, so after we're done, if a couple little kids want to see us close up, we can do it again with some smaller ones. But what I'd like you to think about is the relationship again, but can science and religion coexist side by side? Or is it the case that religion is just empty air? Okay, complementary. So this is the perspective that I suggested in the beginning, that the two overlap. How much they overlap is a debating point, and actually varies with what you're talking about. If you're talking cosmology, the overlap is really high. If you're talking high-end mathematics, the overlap is very high. If you're talking explaining this, I really don't need to go to God to, this is, although initially mathematics, you all remember Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared c squared. What they never taught you, Pythagorean set up schools that lasted for over 300 years. And they mixed mysticism or religion with math and music. From hence we got the notion of the music of the spheres, which led to the field of astronomy. So there is actually interesting overlap. So natural philosophy is what we call science. Carl Sagan, always brilliant to quote, cosmos is a Greek word for the order of the universe. It turns out that both science and religion believe one thing on pure faith. And that is that the universe, one verse, one logos, is rule-bound. You cannot do science unless you believe that. There'd be no purpose. Well, this time, the yellow and blue had to be green, but if I did it the next time, it'd be orange. No. This time it all fit in one, but the next time it wouldn't. No, you couldn't do science. So you have to believe that there's rules, universal rules, that humans can discover. Religion is the same belief. And any scientist would tell you that that is the fundamental faith element, because there's well, I've done 10,000 experiments. It always shows it. Just because you've seen 10,000 white swans doesn't mean a black swan doesn't exist. You can never prove in the classical Greek sense or in the modern cognitive sense, you can't prove that principle. It's a principle of faith. So the big story here, the metaphor of the two books, dates back to St. Augustine, who was a pagan convert to Catholicism, brilliant philosopher, brilliant author, totally separate from the God issue. Catholics called him a saint, one of the founding fathers, so to speak. All of these scientists, and a few more I'm going to show you very, very quickly, all believed in this, that they believed that there were two books that God wrote. One was the book of Scripture, which you got to understand went through human beings in a particular time and place. So as far back as 400 AD, Augustine talked at great length about why literal interpretation of the Bible in many cases is wrong. We're missing the point by trying to literally interpret it. And in some cases he said, yeah, You take that for the word it is. But in many cases, like the age of the earth and stuff, St. Augustine never would have been bound up in all that stuff, that nonsense. He would have said it's nonsense. And we look stupid, he said. He literally wrote another quote. We look stupid if we don't understand science and math. And we're trying to talk to pagans. Christians, Catholics at that time looked stupid, is what St. Augustine said. The other book was the Book of Nature. And that's the book of natural philosophy or science. I have web links and stuff just because this is being recorded and anybody wants to check out any of that, you can. So this historical synergistic interreaction of religion and science is what I want to spend just a quick few minutes running through some various quotes on. And I'm going to hit, some of these I'm going to go quickly because there's at least one other activity I definitely want to get to. So the father of modern astronomy, we're right here in the Kopernik Observatory and Science Center. This is spelt the Polish way. When you look in the history of science, you next to never see Kopernik with a K. Copernicus was actually a Catholic cleric. There are orders within the Catholic faith of secular people, so you can marry and do stuff, but you're still religious. You've been trained as a cleric. He dedicated his famous book to Pope Paul III. So he surely didn't think there was a conflict. In it, he wrote things that for the first, up until the 1800s, most scientists actually wrote about God in their papers. You don't do that now. You don't get published in a scientific journal by mentioning God. But Newton and Kepler and Galileo, all of them did. So he said, the universe has been wrought for us by a supremely good and orderly creator. So this is typically marked as the starting point of the so-called scientific revolution. And the founder was a Roman Catholic cleric who wrote stuff like, to know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and his majesty and power. The Most High wouldn't want us to be ignorant. Drew already talked about this. This was going to be a commercial break. He already talked about it. We've got the 50th anniversary coming up. Please stay tuned, get involved. It'll be a great event. And this building here hasn't been substantially revised since 93, Laura? 93, so it's time. So we're hoping to raise friends and funds for the next 50 years. So you could be part of that. Galileo, we could give a whole talk on the myths. Galileo never went to jail. He was never tortured. This was a political problem. And it's a fascinating story which we don't have time to go into. But Galileo says, I do not feel obliged to believe the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. I would say this quote here was from the cardinal who was part of the Inquisition. Cardinal Bellarmine said, the intention of the Holy Spirit is to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how the heavens go. That when he said a high eminent degree, it was Cardinal Bellarmine who said those words. Kepler, since we are astronomers, a priest of the highest God, they're writing in their scientific documents, they're writing stuff like this. So, but it turns out the distinction might be like clear. Methodologically, when we do an experiment, many scientists are informed by the fact, the way these early scientists believe. Some are atheists. All have to have faith that there's order. But we agreed methodologically, because if you say God did it, then it's, well, you sort of stop questioning, and then the game's done. So scientists keep pushing the question and agree we're not going to pull God out of the hat, even if he's always there and we recognize he's there. We got proximate causes to explain. So Kepler, the father of field of geology, was actually a convert to Catholicism, a priest, and later became a bishop, and he's now on his way to being a saint. He founded this whole field of looking at the Earth's layers. Beautiful is what we see. More beautiful is what we know. Most beautiful by far is what we don't know. And that science is always looking at what we don't know, what's next. And we never say, oh, we're getting closer to running out of stuff. Newton, in his famous book, written in Latin, like most of these works were, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, we review that Mathematical Principles of Science, said, this is right in the book that everyone quotes, and this is great. He's writing about God right in the book. All these quotes here are from that. the most beautiful system of the sun, planets, comets could only proceed from the council dominion of an intelligent, powerful being. I won't read all of them. We're running out of time, but you'll have those if you're interested. The father of chemistry, Robert Boyle, who explained all about how gases worked. He says the two great books of nature and scripture have the same author, so the latter does not hinder at all the inquisitive man's delight in the study of the former. Again, these are not exceptions. This is how science, these are the scientists who found, Father of genetics was a priest, a monk, I should say. He said man must contribute his minimum work of toil, and God gives growth. Truly the seed, the talent, the grace of God is there, and man has simply to work. So the founder of modern genetics did his famous pea studies. Father of microbiology, Louis Pasteur. The more I study nature, the more I stand amazed at the work of the Creator. Science brings men nearer to God. Little science takes you away from God, but more of it takes you to him. Pasteurization, the germ theory, vaccinations. Last one I'll pull out for now. Father of the Big Bang was a priest. The Big Bang was used by a brilliant atheist astronomer by the name of Fred Hoyle to poke fun at it. It's Fred Hoyle himself later acknowledged this theory is the best theory we have of how things started. The Earth was created out of nothing about 13.8 billion years ago. And the man who gave us that was an Einsteinian physicist and mathematician who happened to be a Roman Catholic priest as well, who obviously saw no conflict. Last one more, I thought. Francis Collins, who most recently led the Human Genome Project to figure out DNA, director of the National Institutes of Health, you heard about him through the pandemic some, is a born-again Christian. He was an acknowledged atheist and a medical doctor before he became a researcher, and God found him, as he put it, and wrote a really interesting book for a scientist, The Language of God. A scientist presents evidence for belief, but again, you can't prove. So for all these ancient scientists and many modern ones, they see consilience between the two. The one helps support the other, but you can't use the evidence, empirical evidence, logical arguments to prove God exists. Let's do one activity here. Drew, we started about 10 minutes late, so when should I cut? Okay. Annette, can you help me here? Pass some of those out. And you've been sitting too long. Help me pass out some, and you help me pass out some of those. So I like using what I call visual participatory analogies. So I can use things to teach people science. So everything I've done before, there's at least a 30-minute science lesson we could have done. You're probably happy I didn't go there. But we could have done that. This is a really interesting device. If you want to make one, the directions here is just take a long sheet of paper. You can type or print. Put science down, put religion below it, fold it in half, and make a strip. And it turns out that the simplistic view of this is if we I've just contradicted my whole point. Science and religion are opposite pages. They're not on the same page, they're opposite. But a mathematician by the name of Mobius, ergo Mobius strip, figured out a really interesting mathematical thing you can do, and that is, and those same people, can you come help me get some tape out? So everyone needs a piece, about 2-inch piece of tape.
Thank you.
That one's shot. It's that one's shot, but that'll work for somebody. So in line with what I'm suggesting, the Mobius strip, and you can do it without the tape, but if you want to make it permanent, the tape will help you. If you take one end, and again, I hate just telling people what to do rather than allowing you to play, but we don't have time to play. So if you take one end and flip it, you get this sort of arrangement called a Mobius strip. And what you can do that without the tape, but when you get the tape, what I'd like you to do then, has somebody taped theirs? Tape it like that, where you flip one end. So again, it's like this. bring them together, and at the end, turn one end upside down. Everybody with me on that? Or if you need help, raise your hand. So rather than a simple loop, we're going to turn it over. And then I want you to tape it like that. So if somebody has theirs taped, okay. So if you have it taped, I'll just demonstrate here. But I'm going to put my thumb on religion and my index finger on science, which is underneath. What you've just created is a one-sided strip of paper. Because if you keep pulling this through, and I'm on the line and I get up to the arrow, and the arrow now, S is up, science is up, and religion is down. A Mobius strip is a strip of paper that's twice as long as it was a minute ago, but only has one side. It turns out this is a mathematical curiosity. When you go home, make a prediction if you cut this in the middle, poke a hole and cut through it, what it'll look like. One other quick application, I can't help. We're here. These were used in belt systems in EJ. We have something that's twice as long, but it's still the same space as a single loop. It turns out it wears more evenly. And so their drive belts would last longer than if you had a simple loop. It would wear on one side and tear. So this Mobius strip has all kinds of interesting things about it. But the analogy that I'd like to use that for is this notion that maybe this book of nature and the scriptures, or religion, maybe they really could feed each other. And that doesn't mean we don't have friction. Irreconcilable differences, maybe even about some things. But there's lots of cases where we can actually complement and help each other. And a Nobel Prize-winning physicist said, "From religion comes a man's purpose. From science, his power to achieve it." Sometimes people ask if religion and science are not opposed to one another. They are, in the sense that the thumb and fingers of my hand, so think of what I just asked you to do, are opposed to one another. It's an opposition by means of which anything can be grasped. So we need both of these to grasp. That's, in fact, one of the things that made us human versus other primates. We do that. Book of Scripture, astronomy, we cannot not quote this. "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They had no speech. They used no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world." We'll be done in just a couple minutes here. You'll get a chance to see this live. The good, the true, and the beautiful through our telescopes here. Let's skip a couple things real quick. The father, who was actually an Episcopalian priest that gave us the word science, was an Anglican priest. Invented all kinds of words, including consilience. So I've got to describe consilience before we're done here. So a little bit of Taoism for you here. Another way of visually thinking about science and religion. Historically, religion drove science, and particularly a belief in a monotheistic God. Doesn't mean it's true. But if you believe everything is an independent God, the Greek and Roman gods, which most of the smartest Greek philosophers didn't believe, that's a mistake. But if you believe that, there's no basis for science because, this guy's starting a war, this guy's doing this. If you believe there's a ruler, a wise and loving ruler that has a plan and has laws, logos, the word, then it makes sense to look for patterns in nature. And that's that two-book metaphor. And so another way of thinking of this, if you don't know about Taoism, it's actually spelled Taoism, not D. It's an ancient religion. And I think the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it's comprehensible. It's the case that the religious faith of the founders of the scientific revolution, I think that wasn't just blind ignorance. Newton wasn't stupid. Or that's just old thinking. I don't believe that's so. I think it's a bit of arrogance to suggest that all these brilliant scientists from the past were all mistaken. Again, it doesn't prove, science doesn't prove religion. Never could. And that takes us, I think, the universe glorifies God in a way I would never have known had I tried to understand the universe scientifically. And
Tom,
yeah.
actually, if you go back to that slide, Father George Coyne actually came here and presented a couple of years ago. He has since passed, but he was the director of the Vatican Observatory for many years.
Which is a major research center, and the priest that follow him, I'm drawing a blank on his name right
Is
now. Starts with the C.
yeah, he's actually a brother.
Oh, a brother, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so the Catholic Church invests a lot in science, actually. Christianity, our universities, Notre Dame and brilliant, Oxford, which is now Protestant, was turned Protestantism when King Henry VIII. And so the important thing about science and religion is to not stop questioning. To keep questioning and agree to disagree at times without being so disagreeable. Because again, the history is there was consilience. There was an overlap. And still for a great many, over 50% of practicing scientists, it's a misnomer most practicing scientists are atheists. And increasingly, it seems to be swinging in the direction of more. Doesn't prove religion is true. But it's data that's interesting nonetheless. So the last thing is your questions. So I should stop. I did. That was an hour.
It was great. No, it turns out it was a brother, a guy, Consilmagno. Anyway, and Brother Guy actually was here as well.
So if you have any questions, I'll venture to try to take a stab at it. Again, this talk will be posted if any of it struck your fancy.
On our YouTube channel, right?
Yep.
Any questions here?
So I just want brief thoughts. I don't know if this is even brief, but
She knows me, so she's trying to.
but I also, because it's a big question or it's a big idea. So how does this relate to the tension between creationism and evolution? You know, especially from the perspective of a high school teacher, and I mean, what is your thinking around that?
I didn't plant this, but I'm going to use it nonetheless. This talk was listed as part 1. My plan is to do more. That is at least a whole hour. But the chief distinction, which I referred to here, the one place where the evangelical atheist and the fundamentalist are on the same page. What they agree on is that there's irreconcilable differences, and that one side says science is right and the other side says religion. If the difference between billions and 6,000 years, literally everything I know as a chemist, physicist, mathematician, all of that would have to be completely wrong. The entire fabric of everything we know would be wrong. That's foolish. And again, as far back as St. Augustine, smart theologians were saying, you got to read this thing, part of its poetry, part of its genealogy, part of it, but that it's not a science book. That was known in 400 AD. So, but that's a much longer talk.
That's what I was saying, but I'm thinking through that now, but just what you shared right now is really helpful.
Yeah. Anything else?
How about, you got religion, but there's many different religions throughout the world.
Yes.
So how does science interact with other religions?
That's a great question. So the history of science as we know it, developed. There are traces. There are several Greek scientists. Archimedes was a modern scientist in every sense of the word. He came this close to inventing calculus hundreds of years BC. But that monotheistic strain is what ultimately led to what we call Chinese and Indians had technology, and some astronomy actually, because they had mathematics. But science as we know it historically arose. There are some New Age scientists have drawn parallels between Buddhism. There's been several popular books written as far back as 40 years ago. The Tao of Physics was one that go into that. That's not something. That's even a harder question than that one there. That's but one could talk about that and give a talk on that. I studied Buddhism in high school. In early college, but that's been a world away for me. I won't do a talk on that. It's been too long. But there have been books that I've read, like the Tao of Physics. and others. Good question.
And any other questions here?
Yeah,
Oh, hold on. Let me just jump over here so that people in the live stream can hear it.
got your teacher voice.
So you said the Western universities started on sort of a religious foundation.
Well, absolutely. The Roman Catholic Church, so the first universities, the earliest, Italy had one, I'm drawing a blank. The most famous one was about 100 years after that first one was Oxford. Was initially Catholic because it was before the Protestant split.
So it seems like now they're almost probably even more so agnostic, or even
There have been criticisms as a Catholic. So I went to, the undergrad school I went to was Thomas More College. It's now called Thomas More University. And one of the criticisms of some Catholic institution is they're not Catholic enough.
So I guess my question goes to where was the rift, or where did the direction shift seemingly over the last 50 years to where they seem more agnostic or almost anti-religious?
Well,
or why?
so from a Catholic background, there's two kinds of sin, and I'll connect this. One is the sin of commission, when you willfully do something bad, wrong, evil, and dumb, I would say. That's the sin of commission, what you do. The other is sin of omission. And the sin of omission in our schools, religious affiliate or not, is to not teach history. So, and pseudo stuff gets put out that historians have said is complete garbage. It's not historically accurate. The trial of Galileo, what is known about that is inaccurate. And so increasingly people found, and science got more complicated too, that what people didn't feel the need anymore to, and thankfully in this case, I mean, if you're writing a science article, I don't think, if it's a new research, you ought not to be talking about God. That can confuse things. And if I write an article for the Journal of Inorganic Chemistry, it's going to be read by Indians and Buddhists and all kinds, Hindus, and so you wouldn't want to frame it. All of our journals became international, and so that's a good thing. That when we write science things, we're not talking about our personal religious beliefs, unless again you write a separate book or something. But in terms of research, but that turn with Cornell and those two books created a whole bunch of, we teach history probably worse than we teach science. And so there's a whole lot of ignorance about the history of religion and the history of science, much less the intersection of the two. Does that help?
Yeah, I think you answered my question. I was really wondering, it seems like, it just seemed like not only has it diverged, but now they're at odds. And from your presentation, it seems like, assumably you're coming from the university, so you have a lot of experience there. It seems like you're saying there really isn't a difference. That was your whole point of your presentation. But the vibe I got on the university was there really is, and they're still at odds. So it's refreshing to hear your take, but I just wonder, I'm not sure where they separated or why they.
What also, we have all this extreme political polarization,
maybe
which is not healthy. Again, one of the quotes that I said is we should agree to disagree without being so disagreeable. Yelling at each other is not good theology, and it's not good science. And universities have been generically blamed as being liberal, and in the good sense of that word, we are. In the sense that we're anti-religious, to some extent, some are, some professors are, anywhere. That's unfortunate.
Thanks.
We do have a question from the YouTube chat. Doug asks, so does religion take over when science runs out of gas? Did God create hydrogen with the properties to form stars, galaxies, planets, and life, and then get out of the way?
Yeah, so two things there. One is the so-called God of the gaps. So if religion, initially we didn't have all these separate disciplines, and so natural theology and natural philosophy intersected. The God of the gaps is if we try to explain things, then God does it, and then the next day there's a scientific explanation that's more concrete, then God is diminished. That's the God of the gaps model. So that's not good theology at that level. you said something else that I missed.
Okay, let me go back to it here. Give me a second here. I just get out of Give me a moment here. It says, did God create hydrogen with the properties to
thank you,
form
Guy,
stars?
Guy. So high-end cosmologists and mathematicians, the very highest level, which is way beyond what I understand. I have a chemistry degree and a master's in chemistry. This is way beyond the science or math that I understand. But they've increasingly, including major ones who won Nobel Prizes, who were atheists, are basically falling back to this. There's over 30 scientific constants and equations that if they were off by 1 in 10 zillion, the universe wouldn't exist. And there'd be no carbon atoms, there'd be no water, there'd be no life. It's called the anthropic principle. And so if you're interested in that, I would look at much more interesting than the God of the Gaps. The God of the Gaps is theology or religion trying to take the place of science because we're at a boundary where we don't understand. But the anthropic principle is beyond that. It's not just a God of the Gaps from my perspective.
All right. I think, unless there's any other questions here, it's time to turn in your keys and and head out. Again,
And
we
if
got
any of the little kids want to see that done or want to do the addition yourself, I'll let a little kid do that here. So we have the 2 waters in the vase, if somebody wants to repeat that. But thank you so much for coming out. Appreciate it. Definitely see the telescope.
Thank you, Tom, very much. At this point, we're still working on selecting or getting speakers for our summer. We have a number of them lined up. We don't have one quite signed up for next Friday, so we may do, if it's clear out, we may just do a clear-only observing session. But go to our website, and we'll keep you up to date with that. And but we've got some exciting things coming up, including a return of Dr. Andy Rivkin, who works at the Applied Physics Laboratory for Johns Hopkins. Last year for Asteroid Day, he was talking about the DART mission, the Double Asteroid Redirection. Double Asteroid Redirection Test. Thank you. So close. Anyway, so he'll be back to talk a little bit more about what we've learned since then, because at the end of this month is International Asteroid Day. So anyway, please head on out. You'll see also on the way out Les Bradshaw, who is a rocketeer, and he always comes up for our Rocket Fest. So he'll you can see a small section of a collection of the rockets that he has built, and he's launched every one of them. So you can certainly ask him some questions. I believe he's still out there. So anyway, thanks again, and head on out to the scopes.